In Revolution, John Lennon sang that if you go carrying pictures of Chairman Mao, you ain't going to make it with anyone anyhow. But it isn't until you study how popular Maoism was in the 1960s that you realise how bold and radical that sentiment is. It's hardly surprising that, as their creation myth is dependent on Mao, the chairman's image still looms over a nation ostensibly ruled by a party that's communist in name only. And as such, his reputation retains vestiges of the esteem he once enjoyed among the population. But what's harder to explain is the support that lingers beyond China's shores. It persists, though, even if only a diluted echo of the Mao fervour that once gripped the West. A mania every bit as strong as that enjoyed by the Soviets during the preceding decades. The obsession with Mao reached its peak during the Cultural Revolution, where simplistic perceptions of rebellion against authority were eagerly seized on by credulous youth across the globe, and by rather more mature individuals who really should have known better. For much of the late 60s and early 70s, the Little Red Book became the standard accessory for students, whose dorms were frequently plastered with posters of Mao. The generation who loved miniskirts, free love, psychedelic rock music, mind-altering drugs, and wild, uninhibited behaviour were utterly seduced by Mao's China, the most repressive state on the planet. And they would have scoffed at anyone who tried to point it out. In Mexico City, Paris, Prague, or, as the phrase had it, from Berkeley to Bengal, Mao mania took hold. In India, Charu Majumdar relied on Mao as the influence for the Marxist Naxalite movement, and he advocated the mass murder of anyone who could be identified as a class enemy, a list of targets which included small shopkeepers and primary school teachers. In California and across America, the Black Panthers also became devotees of Mao, seeing him as a mentor in the tactics of guerrilla warfare. In 1967, Bobby Seale, the movement's founder, and Huey Newton hit on the wheeze of selling copies of the Little Red Book on Berkeley's campus to raise cash to buy weapons they intended to use against the police. Both men believed the revolutionary principles of Mao's quotations applied to their own situation, and they eagerly absorbed its militant rhetoric. A significant number of radical organisations sprang up in America in the late 60s, and Maoism was a major influence in the majority of them. Detroit was a particularly fertile area for Maoist activism, though these groups took a special hold at San Francisco University and Berkeley University of California, where study groups met at Eldridge Cleaver's house. There are numerous apologists who spoke up for Mao in the wake of the Great Leap Forward too. Edgar Snow, the American dupe, dismissed any suggestion of starvation, while the British journalist Felix Green, cousin of the author Graham, wrote in his 1964 book A Curtain of Ignorance that he had travelled throughout China in 1960 and seen no evidence of famine. In 1961, François Mitterrand, the left-wing politician who later became French president, met with Mao in China. He described him as a great scholar known in the entire world for the diversity of his genius. There was, he insisted, no famine, just a period of scarcity. Some period. Mao's disastrous attempt to overturn the market and impose socialism had killed 45 million people in just 4 years. But Che Guevara was a great admirer too. In another letter to his Aunt Beatrice on 5th of January 1954, Che declared his intent to lead a studious life, until my friend Mao calls me. He declared he held a great admiration for Chinese communism, and believed their example had much to teach the Latin American revolutionaries. Che devoted himself to reading the complete works of the chairman, and when his first daughter Hildita was born on 15th of February 1956, the proud father wrote that she has come out exactly like Mao Zedong, with the compassionate eyes of the boss. He called his daughter my little Mao. He read her poetry and promised that soon the whole continent would be fighting against the great enemy, Yankee imperialism. Jose Pablo Robelta, a black Cuban educated in Prague, joined Che in the Cuban Revolution. Robelta focused on getting the men to follow the example of an inspirational guerrilla leader who had much to teach them, Mao Zedong. Che venerated guerrilla warfare too, and his focus on agrarian peasant reform and large irrigation projects showed a strong Maoist influence as well. In November 1960, Che travelled to China, where he met Mao and Zhou Enlai. He was impressed by what he saw there and praised the commune system, even as the worst famine in history raged all about him. When he returned home, Che spoke on Cuban television and singled out China and North Korea for praise. Of China, he said, "There are absolutely none of the symptoms of misery that one sees in other Asian countries. Everyone eats, everyone is dressed uniformly, it's true, but everyone is decently dressed, everybody has work, and an extraordinary spirit." Che liked North Korea even more, and claimed that, of all the socialist countries we visited in person, Korea is one of the most extraordinary. It is perhaps the one that impressed us most of all. He privately admitted that his loyalty now inclined to China, which seemed dedicated to a purer version of communism than the pigsty of Russia. Mao's regime remained his staunch ally for the rest of his life, though they were too moderate for his tastes. And in February 1964, Che listed Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin and Mao as examples to follow. Ted Bull, the communist trade union leader in Australia, was also a vocal supporter of Mao, and he attempted to silence critics of the regime as enemies of the Chinese people. The Italian film director and avowed leftist, Michelangelo Antonioni, made a documentary on Mao's China. Wikipedia revealed their own brazen left-wing bias and rampant dishonesty when claiming the film was severely denounced by Chinese authorities as anti-Chinese and anti-communist. In fact, the film was a glowing tribute to Mao and the entire history of communist China. But as Antonioni had been hired by Zhou Enlai, his film was denounced by Zhu's rivals in the Gang of Four, vital evidence that Wikipedia decided to bury. And if you try and edit that page, your work will be deleted faster than you can say cultural revolution. But Antonioni was far from alone, as Mao fever swept Italy in that period. Italian students particularly idolised the Red Guards and their rebellion against bourgeois teaching practices. And little red books became their ubiquitous fashion accessory around 1966-7. The Red Brigades and other terrorist cells were especially fanatical followers of the chairman, with Mao mania reaching a peak in 1969 and enduring for several years afterwards. French Maoism also thrived between 1966 and 1967, and the French intellectual elite fell for Mao every bit as hard as they had fallen for Stalin. It seems the left-wing intelligentsia never tire of backing the wrong horse. The Cultural Revolution had a number of significant and influential cheerleaders, including Jean-Luc Godard, Jean-Paul Sartre, Philippe Soler, Julia Kristen, Louis Althusser and Michel Foucault. Simone de Beauvoir accepted the veracity of Chinese propaganda without question, while dismissing all critics of the Maoist regime as lacking in academic rigour. China joined Cuba and Vietnam among the great triumvirate of French radical causes of the period, with the war in Southeast Asia sparking the student violence of 1968. French radicalism spiked in the period after that summer, and Maoism was at its absolute centre. But the Little Red Book was well established by then, having already sold some 4,000 copies in Paris by the end of 1966. Mao jackets had become commonplace in French boutiques, and Godard's film, La Chinoise, gave a gloss of French chic to Maoist propaganda. It depicted pouting Parisian beauties and dashing young radicals, stylishly puffing on Gaulois while praising Maoist wisdom. The Little Red Book was ever present as the radicals' Bible. But while Godard's production fused Chinese politics, French fashion, and stirring imagery of Mao with influential élan, a 1974 Jean Yan picture, Le Chinois à Paris, went even further by fantasizing about the Chinese Red Army invading Paris. Louis Althusser heaped lavish praise on Mao's on-contradiction, before proving his socialist virtue by strangling his wife. Alain Badiou, who Yi-Ching Wu claims is arguably the most important French philosopher today, was another ardent supporter of the Cultural Revolution, calling it the only true political creation of the 60s and 70s. Badiou was, more worryingly, still eulogising Maoism over 30 years after the chairman's death. Slavoj Žižek, a Yugoslavian leftist, spent decades defending the excesses of Maoism too. But then Žižek and Badiou both celebrated the terror of the Jacobins and Stalin as well. E.H. Carr also defended Mao's China in 1966, just as the Cultural Revolution assaulted those who had survived the chairman's Great Famine. Even after the dictator's death, Carr regarded the abandonment of Maoism as a regressive development. More worryingly, the Little Red Book still inspires much interest on the campus at Berkeley in the 21st century. Michael Crook, a Briton who lived in China after his communist father emigrated there, still says that he thought Mao was doing a wonderful thing with the Cultural Revolution, while he despairs about the polarisation that has resulted from China's recent economic success. Britain's contemporary Labour Party also appears to remain part of the Maoist club. Seamus Milne has oft defended Mao, while John McDonnell went as far as waving the Little Red Book around in the House of Commons. Diane Abbott, when appearing on Andrew Neil's television programme, smugly announced that, on balance, Mao did more good than harm, compounding her crime by laughing while adding, he led his country from feudalism, he helped to defeat the Japanese, and he left his country on the verge of the great economic success they're having now, revealing that she had swallowed Maoist propaganda wholesale without ever studying 20th century Chinese history. Because the truth is, Mao had returned his country to feudalism. It was the Americans and the nationalists who defeated the Japanese, while Mao hid from them and decimated the ranks of the communists. And China's great economic success is a reaction against everything Mao did, not a fruit of any seeds he had laid. Perhaps such individuals had been influenced by Tony Benn, one of the iconic figures of their movement, who had declared himself to be a great admirer of Mao. In fact, in 1996, Tony Benn had called Mao the greatest man of the 20th century. But then he'd also defended Robert Mugabe. In a diary entry of 4th of March 1980, Benn gushed how Robert Mugabe had won the Rhodesian elections outright. It's a fantastic victory, and I can't think of anything that has given me such pleasure for a long time. When I think of the systematic distortions of the British right-wing press, it's an absolute disgrace. Some of Mao's supporters were deeply peculiar, none more so than Aravindan Balakrishnan, who referred to himself as Comrade Bala, and founded the Workers' Institute of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong Thought in Brixton, South London. The Little Conclave was a communist collective in which only plain overalls were permitted, laughter was banned, the idea of family and friends were denigrated, and the other members, a group of women, spied on and informed on each other before enthusiastically joining in the subsequent beatings and punishments. The members were also repulsed by the evil British fascist state which supported them and the ugly, dirty whites they lived among, while they plotted their own Year Zero in which they would remake the world. The Commune lasted for 30 years, but in 2016, the violent and controlling leader of the group was put on trial and received a well-merited life sentence for crimes like repeatedly stamping on his pregnant daughter's stomach. But while Comrade Bala was clearly unhinged, there were many far more respectable supporters of Mao, as we've already seen. Frederick Jameson was another, and the American Yale graduate, acclaimed Marxist intellectual and flag bearer for the Cuban Revolution, described Maoism as the richest of all the greatest new ideologies of the 60s, embodying universal liberation, a global unbinding of energies. Felix Green, the British journalist, produced a number of documentaries which painted an unrealistically rosy picture of communist China, a failing he later repeated with Vietnam, while the British economist Joan Robinson also extolled Maoism, even after visiting China during the Cultural Revolution. One witness, Arvan Das, recalled her visit to the Delhi School of Economics while travelling back from China. She had a Mao cap perched on her head and brandished a copy of the Little Red Book while praising the progressive approach of the Chinese Communist Party. Das recalled that whenever someone threw her a critical question about China, she would read out an appropriate quotation. For example, when someone asked her, "Don't you think Marxism is dogmatic?" her answer was, "Chairman Mao says dogma is worse than cow dung," and so on. But surely the most influential of Mao's cheerleaders was Edgar Snow. The American had joined a pilgrimage to Yan'an, and in 1937 produced a book on his experiences entitled Red Star Over China. It was a sympathetic depiction that advertised the Chinese Communist Party as the humble and virtuous harbingers of a new, better society. And Snow spent the next few decades as Chinese communism's most outspoken cheerleader and advocate. During the Great Leap, he repeatedly claimed that stories of starvation were a myth, though such was Mao's delusional paranoia that he became convinced Snow was an agent of the CIA. But while Edgar Snow was Mao's most notorious dupe, his most infamous disciple was undoubtedly Abimael Guzman Reynoso, who adopted the name Chairman Gonzalo. Reynoso, with his thick-rimmed glasses, manicured moustache, swept-back hair, and habit of strutting like a peacock, conjures up images of Trotsky. The founder of the Shining Path in Peru was a university lecturer in philosophy, and a devout Marxist who viewed Maoism as a higher, more evolved strain of socialist ideology. Despite coming from a wealthy family who were part of the Spanish colonial population, and having little contact with the indigenous Indians, he had no hesitation in identifying himself as their champion, and applied class-based theories to an essentially ethnic issue, much to the consternation of the people he claimed to represent. He arrogantly sought to impose the Chinese vision of a peasant guerrilla insurrection on Peru, and collected a large and loyal band of students and followers before unleashing a vicious campaign in 1980 that continued to escalate for over a decade. Initially, the group murdered rival leftists, peasants they regarded as being disloyal, workers who opted not to join strikes, government employees, and the police, until they eventually shifted their focus to the cities in an extensive bombing campaign that targeted banks, hotels, businesses, and embassies. By the time Guzman was captured and sentenced to life in 1992, Shining Path's crusade had resulted in 70,000 deaths, created 600,000 refugees, forced 1 million more to flee the country to escape the violence, and had destroyed $24 billion worth of infrastructure. It was all for nothing. There'd been no war, dictatorship, or genuine suppression in Peru, a nation which had been growing increasingly prosperous, democratic, and well-educated through the 60s and 70s, before shining Park's reign of terror and violence threw that process into reverse. Yet the repulsive Guzman remained smug and unrepentant after his capture, raising his fist in the radical salute like some pathetically geriatric student, still utterly convinced in his approach. You'd have hoped that after spending decades supporting the horrors of Mao and Stalin, that the intelligentsia and the broader movement of the left would finally have learnt their lesson. But as we'll see in the next part, that's a lesson that they will never learn, because evidence just seems to pass them by. If you'd like to support this channel, please like and subscribe. And if you're interested in these topics, I've written 2 books which go into them in extensive detail. They're called The Tyranny of the Left, and they're available on the links below. Please feel free to pick them up and let me know what you think. Thank you.